Hello, we're here at Gamescom 2017 in Cologne. With us is Ian and Giles from Talespinners. Thank you for taking a couple of minutes out of your busy schedule to talk to us. And okay, let's get right into it. So, do you feel that narrative design for computer games is in a good place right now?
Yes, yeah, absolutely. So, the reason that I think it's in a good place is the rise over the last 5-6 years of indies specifically, because story had stagnated quite a bit on the big franchises, and you had the same as happened in Hollywood. You had this thing where people would produce a movie that followed up another movie that was really successful and had kind of the same thing, same elements. The same happened with Call of Duty and all of those things. And because Unity and Unreal and similar game-making tools became cheap and then free, it meant that you had small teams coming into the industry, and really from places they'd never come before, because they weren't programmers necessarily, they weren't even game designers at that time, and just trying to make something different, sometimes because they'd never been told that they couldn't. And so they started making things on much smaller budgets. They're a lot nimbler. Some of those companies sink, obviously, but some of those companies do really well. And the big companies start to see these really interesting narrative experiences and narrative mechanics that are created by these small companies, and they see that those things sell, and so they start to incorporate some of those into the bigger games. And I think, if anything, the indie revolution over the last few years has proved that there is a huge appetite for narrative. If you think some of the bigger titles that have come out from the indie revolution, I mean, things like Gone Home, things like Dear Esther, things like Firewatch, now Tacoma, of course, as well, but even things like Journey, which is hugely narrative, and the big companies see that and they start paying attention, so that affects the top end of the spectrum as well. So absolutely, it's better than it's been possibly at any other time in the games industry.
Yeah. The thing that's really interesting at the moment as well are the developers who are realising that story is so much more than just cinematics, just dialogue, and actually leveraging every single aspect of how a game communicates to express narrative and story and context and purpose. And that's one of the things that's really encouraging. One of the things that we enjoy doing, actually, is looking at kind of less obvious ways of delivering story. And the other thing is, everyone's getting more articulate with how they tell stories, like more sophisticated. And instead of trying to just copy films, developers are remembering that they're making a game, that they can leverage mechanics to tell that story, that they can use, that they can be more than film. And that's one of the things that's really compelling about narrative design.
I mean, off the top of my head, if you even start looking at things like Braid, things like Thomas was alone, I suppose, but the one I think is a fantastic example, I don't want to spoil it for anybody watching, but is Brothers, Two Sons. If you haven't played that, if anybody watching hasn't played that, play that, because it will teach you something. Play it through to the end, because it will teach you something about story that you never thought a game could do. It's fascinating, really fascinating.
So, you gave some good examples of good narrative games now. I mean, a couple of years back, there often, for me as a player at least, it felt that the story was kind of a second thought after the game mechanics. So I mean, you as a service provider, how do you went to game studios or publishers and kind of got the idea through that, hey, story matters, narrative design matters, it's important?
Sure, okay, so there's several things there really. Yes, I think that it's still a case that a lot of people maybe don't think about a story first. But there's also this kind of false, I think, idea, which Giles was talking about a little earlier, that you have a game and then you add the story on top. You sort of sprinkle it on top to make magic happen. And that could be, cutscenes or character designs or graffiti on the walls or whatever it is. But story narrative isn't just an additional thing. It's there in almost every game. The example that a colleague of mine came up with recently is look at Asteroids. Okay, you'd say maybe Asteroids hasn't got story, but actually it's got context, it does have story. You are a ship, you're shooting asteroids. As soon as you said that to somebody, they understand what to do in the game. If you just said, you've got to rotate this kind of line-based pixel thing and shoot at other things, that's actually much harder to explain than you're a ship shooting asteroids. Yeah. So story is inherent in almost any game, and there are a couple of tricks about how to kind of merge the two satisfyingly. And I think that's a bad choice of word for somebody who's supposed to be a writer. But I think that's really our key takeaway is where the story and the game feel separate. That's when there's a problem. And actually what we try and do, and what the best games out there are trying to do, is merge those things so that the mechanics and the gameplay is supporting the story and vice versa. And it's difficult to tell where gameplay stops and where story starts.
It kind of feels as one entity.
Yeah, absolutely. You shouldn't notice whether something is gameplay or story. You shouldn't go, and now it's time for a cutscene. A brilliant example of this in the last few years, I think, just from a storytelling point of view, is Inside, that Playdead released last year. A game that you could say has no story because it has no text, it has no dialogue, but it is a brilliant piece of storytelling, and it never interrupts you to tell the story, and it just plays out as you play. And again, if anybody hasn't played it, I strongly suggest that they play it.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's fair to say as well that the balance between a game story's importance varies from game to game. Like, for instance, when you're playing Pac-Man, the story isn't really that important, but it is there. And it's the same thing, if something's strongly narrative driven, then the story is hugely important. But one of the common misconceptions that we have is a lot of developers think that story and plot are the same thing. And so their game may have no plot, but if it presents any action within any context, it has story. It communicates meaning. There is a reason why a character is doing something. There's a reason why they're dressing a particular way. There's a reason why they're limping, why they have a scar, why they're so tall, why they're carrying a particular weapon. Context and action together, there is always story. Unless you're dealing with just squares, even then there's going to be context. There's going to be a reason why. Because games are typically experiences or objectives. And there's not many instances where an experience or an objective is devoid of context. So, yeah, it's really just trying... We just talk to anyone about how we can make that better.
Yeah. And make it go in the same direction. I mean, there is a term thrown around in kind of game writing circles, Ludonarrative Dissonance, which I only just managed to pronounce because I haven't had enough water, but it's essentially where the story goes one way and the game goes the other way, and that to us is the kind of biggest sin, I suppose, where the story isn't supporting the game. For example, a game in which you're a man of peace, and all the cutscenes emphasise the fact that you're a man of peace, and yet the gameplay is you shooting lots of people, that kind of thing. So it's really where we are is trying to, as I said, knit them as tightly as you can so you don't notice the joins.
Your company is called Talespinners, and you provide story and narrative service for game developers. Can you tell us a bit about what exactly you offer and what lessons you learned working closely together with a lot of different game studios and game companies? Sure.
Well, I suppose the overall lesson before going into what we do is that every game story is different. Everybody comes to us with a different, with a game at a different state, a game at a different stage with a different set of ideas. So essentially what we do is we work with small indie and I guess AA, up to AA clients who aren't big enough to have a writer on staff permanently. They maybe have a great idea for a story, but they can't write dialogue, for example. They're no good at character dialogue, either because they're simply not writers or because they're doing it in a different language. Or they could come to us with some lovely graphics, as has happened, and a little bit of mechanics, but they don't know who the characters are, they don't know what they're trying to do, they don't know what their objectives are, and we can flesh out the world. So it's part of what we offer is the writing service, which is kind of dialogue and text. The other half is really contextualizing everything, so world building. How does magic work in this world? How old is this world? What's its history? What's its lore? How many different factions are they? Which way do they dress? Stuff which kind of overlaps with art department, for example, or sound, or game design. So we'll work with all of those departments, and depending on the game and at what stage we come in, we might create a world bible, which is essentially a kind of resource for all of those departments to go to and go, well, I'm designing a new level. Should there be anything written on the rocks? Is this an ancient monument of some sort? Oh, who made it? Oh, what style of lettering is it? That kind of thing. So we feed really into every different department. So we can come in really early and do that kind of work. We can come in really late and do that kind of work because the people have got really confused about what they're doing and there's a whole tangled mess of story which happens. We can come in at the point where people know their story, from the beginning to the end, but maybe it just needs punching up, made more dramatic. And we can come in right at the end when they pretty much have everything. They just want maybe the dialogue to sparkle some more.
Yeah, and it's actually really, really fun to come into the projects at all these different stages, because it means that our workday is incredibly varied. So there's never a dull day. But it's interesting as well, because you get to see the different methodologies of different studios and how they approach story, how they discuss story, their different understandings of story. One of the things that is perhaps most enjoyable is looking at a game that has a plot, but the story, the theme, the emotional takeaway, the essence of it hasn't yet been identified, and it's not through any deficiency of the developer. It's just that they're so focused on making the best game they can that slightly more theoretical or emotional aspects of the story might just be slipping them by. And that's one of the fun things to do, is to then actually talk to the developers and say, so this is the story that you've built. Is this what you intended? And it's like you've kind of got a key and unlocked something in their heart, and they've gone, oh, that's it. And you get it. And that's the thing, is channeling that, articulating that, making sure it's front and center in the mechanics, in the art design, in the sound design, in every aspect of the game, so that it is a cohesive story experience.
Yeah, we often come in at the point where that kind of thing's sort of fuzzy, where they've built the game, but as Giles said, they're not quite clear on what it is they're actually trying to say and what the takeaway is, and sort of sharpening that, honing that, and pointing out where they're maybe undermining their own message in places and trying to sort of focus it is something which every department can be involved in. Once we've kind of helped them decide on it and help them articulate it and point it out and hopefully get it out a really clear sentence of some sort, and then every department can kind of use that as a filter and go through their game going, well, does this bit that I'm doing really reinforce that? Oh, maybe I could just polish this little bit of art, and suddenly, without the player knowing, they're going to be more guided towards that route. So
it becomes a pillar of the game and of the experience. Yeah. And it's great, because when you help developers to realise that, and suddenly everything just clicks into place, it just makes everyone happier, and it makes the game better, because happy developers make better games.
Yeah, definitely, cool. And one last question, do you have any opinion on VR in regards to narrative design? So if you take a peek into a crystal ball, what do you think, how will VR change the way we tell stories?
So I have several opinions on VR, and I could go on about VR for a very long time. So let's assume that VR is going to continue for the time being and hopefully ramp up a bit and get a bit more exposure. I think many developers make a bit of a mistake with VR, which they approach it from one of two angles. Either they approach it from the viewpoint of a game dev, and they make a game in VR and they try and tell story in the way that they have learned to tell story in games for the last few years, or they approach it from a film point of view. They're a filmmaker trying out VR, and they attempt to approach the writing as if it was a film. And actually, neither of those mediums, game or cinema, is close to VR. The thing which I keep going back to as the closest medium to VR to me is actually theatre, is immersive theatre. Is you stepping into a space and things happening around you, and you are writing so that the audience will pick up story points around them, and they may be looking a different direction, they may be actually concentrating on something completely different, and you need to make sure that you're drawing attention to a particular thing. It could be through sound, it could be through waiting until they've turned around, it could be through lighting, it could be whatever. But if you treat it as that, if you treat it as an immersive space, if you treat it as theatre, I think you're a lot closer to nailing what VR actually is. So as a storytelling medium, because it's so young, there's this weird thing that happens when somebody steps into a game right now, a VR game right now, where the story can be happening, it can be quite a complicated story, it can be, this big grandiose thing, but because people stepping into it are so new to VR and they're still not quite sure what to do, they may be concentrating on the objects in front of them and still kind of in love with, just playing with the world and playing with the medium. So maybe actually they don't need to be told a great big story and led off down a big route. Maybe they just need to be given a toy box. You'll see a lot of demos like that. Things like Job Simulator, things like Accountant, all of those kind of things are really just fancy toy boxes.
But even in that toy box, you're still looking at the context and the choice of the toys, of the objects, and what that says about the world, about the worldview of the developers, of the storytellers, and building that experience to still say something, even if the player's experience is to pick things up, throw things around, break windows,
But that toy box model typically doesn't fit onto, well, either the cinema kind of format or most games story. Most games that people go, this game has a story, doesn't fit that mold at all, and it's a bit of a different way to think about it, really. I think there are so many games that you play on VR, they still feel like tech demos. They feel really young demos. There are one or two which have excellent story. Again, recommendation, the Batman Arkham VR does some really good work with the way that the player perceives the world, does some really good work with taking some of the VR tropes and turning them into actual narrative moments rather than just a VR game mechanic. Again, it's worth checking out if you have access to a VR rig that will play it, just to see some really interesting pieces of story in there.
I mean, the thing that's amazing about that in particular is that sense of presence.
Yeah.
It's not just controlling a character, it's kind of looking down and seeing you're actually in a character's shoes, and when you confront that character, having them get up right in your face, and when you encounter the Joker in that experience, you don't forget that in a hurry. It's not, and you survive the Joker.
It's fascinating. It's something that was a bit of a revelation to me when I first started playing VR, because I expected the sense of space and the sense of place and the sense that you were a figure in the world. But what's quite amazing is even if the art is slightly stylized, the other characters in the world feel like they're real. You get a sense that over there that's talking to me is a person. And it's really hard because your brain is conditioned to think like that. Everybody was worried when VR first came out that, there's a character standing there. What if the player puts their head through them? But you can't, because humans don't put their heads through other humans, and your hindbrain kind of kicks in and controls you, and you think that person is real. And I think that ability of VR to embody a character that feels utterly real, no matter the quality of the graphics, is astounding. And I think people are starting to learn to leverage that properly. And that, of course, is great for story, because story is all about interrelationship between people. It's all about drama. It's much more about people versus people than it is guns versus giant robots.
If I were to look into my crystal ball about VR, though, I would say, seriously, it's about short stories.
Yeah.
It's about telling tight narratives that communicate an idea, or that really experiment with the setting or the form or the delivery. And I think with VR as well, the sweet spot is when you kind of play something for 15-minute bursts, rather than big, long. A 40-hour RPG in VR might be a bit much, but something that really kind of bounces around, almost like the Animatrix, the short film compilation that came out quite a while ago for the Matrix, where different animation styles, different stories, different ideas and themes, but all within a particular framework.
And in VR particularly, you can't go wrong really if those stories are imparted to you by exploring a space. In a way like Gone Home, again, I suppose. But because you are putting a person in an environment, you shouldn't overlook the ability of them to explore that environment and gain so much story that way.
We have got a fair few ideas, and there's one that I need to talk to you about straight after this, because it's right up your street.
But we're working on a few concepts, a few VR projects with clients right now.
Cool. Looking forward to seeing some of those in years to come.
Yeah, hope so.
Cool. Thank you very much for taking your time.
Thank you.
Very interesting viewpoints. Thank you. And have fun for the rest of your show here.
Thank you very much. Thank you.